21. Treacher's Gorge. They crossed the plains northward in confidence and good spirits. No danger or report of danger appeared anywhere along their way, and the Ranahin rode the grasslands like live blazonry, challenges uttered in flesh. Foam Follower told gay tales as if he wished to show that he had reached the end of a passing travail. Quan and his warriors responded with ripostes and jests, and the Ramen entertained them with displays of hunting skill. The company rode late into the first night in defiance of the dismal moon. And the second night they camped on the south bank of Rome's Edge Ford. But early the next morning they crossed the ford and turned northeast up a broad way between the Rome's Edge and Moss. By mid-afternoon, they reached the eastmost edge of the forest. From there, the Rome's Edge, the northern border of the plains, swung more directly eastward. And the company went on northeast, away from both Moss and the plains of Ra. That night, they slept on the edge of a stark, unfriendly flatland where no people lived, and few willingly traveled. The whole region north of them was cut and scarred and darkened like an ancient battleground, a huge field that had been ruined by the shedding of too much blood. Scrub grass, stunted trees, and a few scattered aliantha took only slight hold on the uncompromising waste. The company was due south of Mount Thunder. As the quest angled northeastward across this land, Morum told Covenant some of its history. It spread east to Landsdrop and formed the natural front of attack for Lord Foul's armies in the ancient wars. From the fall of the river Landrider to Mount Thunder was open terrain along the great cliff of Landsdrop. The hordes issuing from Foul's Creche could ascend in scores of places to bring battle to the upper land. So it was that the first great battles in all the land's wars against the Despiser occurred across this ravaged plain. Age after age, the defenders strove to halt Lord Foul at Landsdrop, and failed because they could not block all the ways up from the spoiled plains and Serengrave Flat. Then Lord Foul's armies passed westward along the Mithil and struck deep into the center plains. In the last war, before Kevin Landwaster had finally been driven to invoke the ritual of desecration, Lord Foul had crushed through the heart of the center plains and had turned north to force the lords to their final battle at Kurash Plenithor, now named Trothgard. In the presence of so much old death, the riders did not travel loudly, but they sang songs during the first few days, and several times they returned to the legend telling of Beric Halfhand and the fire lions of Mount Thunder. On this wilderland Beric had fought, suffering the deaths of his friends and the loss of his fingers in battle. Here he had met despair and had fled to the slopes of Graven Threndor, the peak of the fire lions, and there he had found both earth friendship and earth power. It was a comforting song, and the riders sang its refrain together as if they sought to make it true for themselves. Beric, earth friend, help and weal, battle aid against the foe. Earth gives and answers powers peal, ringing earth friend, help and heal, cleanse the land from bloody death and woe. They needed its comfort. The hard-reft and harrowed warland seemed to say that Beric's victory was an illusion, that all his earth friendship and his staff of law and his lineage of lords, his mighty works and the works of his descendants amounted to so much scrub grass and charred rock and dust, that the true history of the land was written here, in the bare topsoil and stone which lay like a litter of graves from the plains of Ra to Mount Thunder, from Andalane to Landsdrop. The atmosphere of the region agitated Foamfollower. He strode at Covenant's side with an air of concealed urgency, as if he were repressing a desire to break into a run. And he talked incessantly, striving to buoy up his spirits with a constant stream of stories and legends and songs. At first his efforts pleased the riders, appeased their deepening, hungry gloom like treasure berries of entertainment. But the questers were on their way toward the bleak black prospect of Drool Rockworm, crouched like a Bane in the catacombs of Mount Thunder. By the fourth day from Rome's Edge Ford, Covenant felt that he was drowning in giantish talk, and the voices of the warriors when they sang sounded more pleading than confident, like whistling against inexorable night. With the Ramen to help him, Prothol found rapid ways over the rough terrain. Long after sunset on that fourth day, when the growing moon stood high and baleful in the night sky, the quest made a weary camp on the edge of Landsdrop. The next dawn, Covenant resisted the temptation to go and look over the great cliff. He wanted to catch a glimpse of the lower land, of the spoiled plains and Sarengrave Flat, regions which had filled Foamfollower's talk in the past days, but he had no intention of exposing himself to an attack of vertigo. The fragile stability of his bargain did not cover gratuitous risks, so he remained in the camp when most of his companions went to gaze out over Landsdrop. But later, as the company rode north within a stone's throw of the edge, he asked Lord Moram to tell him about the great cliff. "Ah, Landsdrop," Moram responded quietly. "There is talk, unfounded even in the oldest legends, that the cleft of Landsdrop was caused by the sacrilege which buried immense banes under Mount Thunder's roots. In a cataclysm that shook its very heart, the earth heaved with revulsion at the evils it was forced to contain. And the force of that dismay broke the upper land from the lower, lifted it toward the sky. So this cliff reaches from deep in the southern range, past the fall of the river Landrider, through the heart of Mount Thunder, at least 50,000 leagues into the mapless winter of the northern climes. It varies in height from place to place, but it stands across all the land and does not allow us to forget." The Lord's rough voice only sharpened Covenant's anxiety. As the company rode, he held his gaze away to the west, trusting the wilderland to anchor him against his instinctive fear of heights. Before noon, the weather changed. Without warning, a sharp wind, bristling with grim preternatural associations, sprang out of the north. In moments, black clouds seethed across the sky. Lightning ripped the air. Thunder pounded like a crushing of boulders. Then, out of the bawling sky, rain struck like a paroxysm of rage, hit with savage force until it stung. The horses lowered their heads as if they were wincing. Torrents battered the riders, drenched, blinded them. Mainthral Lithe sent her cords scouting ahead to keep the company from plunging over Landsdrop. Prothol raised his staff with bright fire flaring at its tip to help keep his companions from losing each other. They huddled together, and the Bloodguard positioned the Ranahin around them to bear the brunt of the attack. In the white revelations of the lightning, Prothol's flare appeared dim and frail, and thunder detonated hugely over, as if exploding at the touch of folly. Covenant crouched low on Dira's back, flinched away from the lightning, as if the sky were stone, which the thunder shattered. He could not see the cords, did not know what was happening around him. He was constantly afraid that Dira's next step would take him over the cliff. He clenched his eyes to Prothal's flame, as if it could keep him from being lost. The skill and simple toughness of the Ramen preserved the company, kept it moving toward Mount Thunder, but the journey seemed like wandering in the collapse of the heavens. The riders could only be sure of their direction because they were always forcing their way into the maw of the storm. The wind flailed the rain in their faces until their eyes felt lacerated and their cheeks shredded, and the cold drenching stiffened their limbs, paralyzed them slowly like the rigor of death. But they went on, as if they were trying to beat down a wall of stone with their foreheads. For 2 full days they pushed onward, felt themselves crumbling under the onslaught of the rain. But they knew neither day nor night, knew nothing but one continuous, pummeling, dark, savage, implacable storm. They rode until they were exhausted, rested on their feet, knee-deep in water and mud, gripping the reins of their horses, ate sopping morsels of food half-warmed by the Lianro fires, which Birenir struggled to keep half alive, counted themselves to be sure no one had been lost, and rode again until they were forced by exhaustion to stop again. At times they felt that Prothal's wan blue flame alone sustained them. Then Lord Moram moved among the company. In the lurid lightning, his face appeared awash with water like a foundering wreck. But he went to each quester, shouted through the howl of wind and rain the devastating thunder, "Drool, storm, for us!" But he, mistaken, main force passes west. Take heart, augurs, for us. Covenant was too worn and cold to respond, but he heard the generous courage behind Moram's words. When the company started forward again, he squinted ahead toward Prothal's flame as if he were peering into a mystery. The struggle went on, prolonged itself far beyond the point where it felt unendurable. In time, endurance itself became abstract, a mere concept, too impalpable to carry conviction. The lash and riot of the storm reduced the riders to raw, quivering flesh, hardly able to cling to their mounts. But Prothal's fire burned on. At each new flash and blast, Covenant reeled in his seat. He wanted nothing in life but a chance to lie down in the mud. But Prothal's fire burned on. It was like a manacle, imprisoning the riders, dragging them forward. In the imminent madness of the torrents, Covenant gritted his gaze as if that manacle were precious to him. Then they passed the boundary. It was as abrupt as if the wall against which they had thrown themselves like usurped titans had suddenly fallen into mud. Within 10 stumbling heartbeats, the end of the storm blew over them, and they stood gasping in a sun-bright noon. They could hear the tumult rushing blindly away. Around them were the remains of the deluge, broken pools and streams and fens, thick mud like wreckage on the battle plain, and before them stood the great ravaged head of Mount Thunder, Graven Threndor, peak of the Fire Lions. For a long moment it held them like an aegis of silence, grim, grave, and august, like an outcropping of the earth's heart. The peak was north and slightly west of them. Taller than Kevin's watch above the upper land, it seemed to kneel on the edge of the Saren grave, with its elbows placed on the plateau and its head high over the cliff, fronting the sky in a strange attitude of pride and prayer. And it rose 12,000 feet over the defile's course, which flowed eastward from its feet. Its sides, from its crumpled foothills to the raw rock of its crown, were bare, not cloaked or defended from storms, snows, besieging time by any trees or grass, but instead wearing sheer fragmented cliffs like facets, some as black as obsidian and others as gray as the ash of a granite fire. as if the stone of the mount were too thick, too charged with power to bear any gentle kind of life. There, deep in the hulky chest of the mountain, was the destination of the quest, Ciril Threndor, Heart of Thunder. They were still 10 leagues from the peak, but the distance was deceptive. Already, that scarred visage dominated the northern horizon. It confronted them over the rift of Landsdrop like an irrefusable demand. Mount Thunder. There Beric Halfhand had found his great revelation. There the quest for the Staff of Law hoped to regain the future of the land. And there Thomas Covenant sought release from the impossibility of his dreams. The company stared at the upraised rock as if it searched their hearts, asked them questions which they could not answer. Then Quan grinned fiercely and said, "At least now we have been washed clean enough for such work." That incongruity cracked the trance which held the riders. Several of the warriors burst into laughter as if recoiling from the strain of the past 2 days, and most of the others chuckled, daring Drool or any enemy to believe that the storm had weakened them. Though nearly prostrated by the exertion of finding a path through the torrents on foot, the Ramen laughed as well, sharing a humor they did not fully understand. Only Foamfollower did not respond. His eyes were fixed on Mount Thunder, and his brows overhung his gaze as if shielding it from something too bright or hot to be beheld directly. The questers found a relatively dry hillock on which to rest and eat, and feed their mounts, and Foamfollower went with them absently. While the company made itself as comfortable as possible for a time, he stood apart and gazed at the mountain as if he were reading secrets in its scored crevices and cliffs. Softly he sang to himself, "Now we are unhomed, bereft of root and kith and kin, from other mysteries of delight. We set our sails to resail our track, but the winds of life blew not the way we chose, and the land beyond the sea was lost." High Lord Prothal let the company rest for as long as he dared in the open plain. Then he moved on again for the remainder of the afternoon, clinging to the edge of Landsdrop as if it were his only hope. Before the storm, Covenant had learned that the sole known entrance to the catacombs of Mount Thunder was through the western chasm of the Soul Seas. Treacher's Gorge, the rocky maw which swallowed the river, only to spit it out again eastward on the lower land, transmogrified by hidden turbulent depths into the defile's course, a stream grey with the sludge and waste of the White Warrens. So Prothal's hope lay in his southern east approach. He believed that by reaching Mount Thunder on the south and moving toward Treacher's Gorge from the east, the company could arrive unseen and unexpected at the gorge's western exposure. But he took no unnecessary risks. Graven Threndor stood perilously large against the sky and seemed already to lean looming toward the company, as if the peak itself were bent to the shape of Drool's malice. He urged the tired Ramen to their best cunning in choosing a way along Landsdrop, and he kept the riders moving until after the sun had set. But all the time he rode slumped agedly in his saddle, with his head bowed, as if he were readying his neck for the stroke of an axe. He seemed to have spent all his strength in pulling his companions through the storm. Whenever he spoke, his long years rattled in his throat. The next morning the sun came up like a wound into ashen skies. Grey clouds overhung the earth, and a shuddering wind fell like a groan from the slopes of Mount Thunder. Across the wasteland, the pools of rainwater began to stagnate, as if the ground refused to drink the moisture, leaving it to rot instead. And as they prepared to ride, the questers heard a low rumble like the march of drums deep in the rock. They could feel the throb in their feet, in their knee joints. It was the beat of mustering war. The High Lord answered as if it were a challenge. "Melancurion," he called clearly, "arise, champions of the land. I hear the drums of the earth. This is the great work of our time." He swung onto his horse with his blue robe fluttering. Warhaft Quan responded with a cheer. "Hail, High Lord Prothal. We are proud to follow." Prothal's shoulders squared. His horse lifted its ears, raised its head, took a few prancing steps as grandly as a Ranahin. The Ranahin nickered humorously at the sight, and the company rode after Prothal boldly, as if the spirits of the ancient lords were in them. They made their way to the slopes of Mount Thunder through the constant buried rumble of the drums. As they found a path across the thickening rubble which surrounded the mountain, the booming subterranean call accompanied them like an exhalation of despite. But when they started up the first battered sides of the peak, they forgot the drums. They had to concentrate on the climb. The foothills were like a gnarled stone mantle which Mount Thunder had shrugged from its shoulders in ages long past. And the way westward over the slopes was hard. Time and again the riders were forced to dismount to lead their mounts down tricky hills or over gray piles of tumbled ashen rock. The difficulty of the terrain made their progress slow, despite all the Ramen could do to search out the easiest trails. The peak seemed to lean gravely over them, as if watching their small struggles, and down onto them from the towering cliffs came a chilling wind as cold as winter. At noon, Prothal halted in a deep gully which ran down the mountainside like a cut. There the company rested and ate. When they were not moving, they could hear the drums clearly, and the cold wind seemed to pounce on them from the cliffs above. They sat in the straight light of the sun and shivered, some at the cold, others at the drums. During the halt, Moram came over to Covenant and suggested that they climb a way up the gully together. Covenant nodded. He was glad to keep himself busy. He followed the Lord up the cut's contorted spine until they reached a break in its west wall. Moram entered the break, and when Covenant stepped in behind the Lord, he got a broad, sudden view of Andalain. From the altitude of the break between the stone walls, he felt that he was looking down over Andalain from a window in the side of Mount Thunder. The hills lay richly over all the western horizon, and their beauty took his breath away. He stared hungrily with a feeling of stasis, of perfect pause in his chest, like a quick grip of eternity. The lush, clear health of Andalain shone like a country of stars despite the gray skies and the dull battle roll. He felt obscurely unwilling to breathe, to break the trance, but after a moment his lungs began to hurt for air. "Here is the land," Moram whispered, grim, powerful Mount Thunder above us. The darkest banes and secrets of the earth and the catacombs beneath our feet, the battleground behind, Serengrave flat below, and there, priceless Andalain, the beauty of life. Yes, this is the heart of the land. He stood reverently, as if he felt himself to be in an august presence. Covenant looked at him. "So you brought me up here to convince me that this is worth fighting for." His mouth twisted on the bitter taste of shame. "You want something from me, some declaration of allegiance, before you have to face Drool." The cave wights he had slain lay hard and cold on his memory. "Of course, the Lord replied, "but it is the land itself which asks for your allegiance." Then he said with sudden intensity, "Behold, Thomas Covenant, use your eyes, look upon it all, look and listen, hear the drums, and hear me. This is the heart of the land. It is not the home of the despiser. He has no place here. Oh, he desires the power of the Banes, but his home is in Fowl's Creche, not here. He has not depth or sternness or beauty enough for this place, and when he works here, it is through Erviles or cave whites. Do you see?" "I see." Covenant met the Lord's gaze flatly. "I've already made my bargain, my peace, if you want to call it that. I'm not going to do any more killing." "Your peace?" Morum echoed in a complex tone. Slowly, the danger dimmed in his eyes. "Well, you must pardon me. In times of trouble, some lords behave strangely." He passed Covenant and started back down the gully. Covenant remained in the window for a moment, watching Morum go. He had not missed the Lord's oblique reference to Kevin, but he wondered what kinship Morum saw between himself and the land waster. Did the Lord believe himself capable of that kind of despair? Muttering silently, Covenant returned to the company. He saw a measuring look in the eyes of the warriors. They were trying to assess what had occurred between him and Lord Morum, but he did not care what portents they read into him. When the company moved on, he led Dura up the side of the gully, blank to the shifting shale, which more than once dropped him to his hands and knees, scratching and bruising him dangerously. He was thinking about the celebration of spring, about the battle of Soaring Woodhelven, about children, and Laura, and Python, and Aetiaran, and the nameless, unfettered one, and Lena, and Treoch, and the warrior who had died defending him, thinking and striving to tell himself that his bargain was secure, that he was not angry enough to risk fighting again. That afternoon, the company struggled on over the arduous ground, drawing slowly together as they worked westward. They caught no glimpses of their destination. Even when the sun fell low in the sky and the roar of waters became a distant accompaniment to the buried beat of the drums, they were still not able to see the gorge. But then they entered a sheer, sheltered ravine in the mountainside. From this ravine, a rift too narrow for the horses angled away into the rock, and through it they could hear a snarling current. In the ravine, the riders left their mounts under the care of the cords. They went ahead on foot down the rift as it curved into the mountain and then broke out of the cliff no more than 100 feet directly above Treacher's Gorge. They no longer heard the drums. The tumult of the river smothered every sound but their own half-shouts. The walls of the chasm were high and sheer, blocking the horizon on either side. But through the spray that covered them like a mist, they could see the gorge itself, the tight rock channel constricting the river until it appeared to scream, and the wild white sunset flame-plumed water thrashing as if it fought against its own frantic rush. From nearly a league away to the west, the river came writhing down the gorge and sped below the company into the guts of the mountain as if sucked into an abyss. Above the gorge, the setting sun hung near the horizon like a ball of blood in the leaden sky, and the light gave a shade of fire to the few hardy trees that clung to the rims of the chasm as if rooted by duty. But within Treacher's Gorge was nothing but spray and sheer stone walls and tortured waters. The roar inundated Covenant's ears, and the mist-wet rock seemed to slip under his feet. For an instant the cliffs reeled. He could feel the maw of Mount Thunder gaping for him. Then he snatched himself back into the rift, stood with his back pressed against the rock, hugged his chest, and fought not to gasp. There was activity around him. He heard shouts of surprise and fear from the warriors at the end of the rift, heard foam followers' strangled howl, but he did not move. He clenched himself against the rock in the mist and roar of the river until his knees steadied, and the scream of slippage eased in his feet. Only then did he go to find out what caused the distress of his companions. He kept one hand braced on the wall and moved the other from shoulder to shoulder among the company as he went forward. Between Covenant and the cliff, foam followers struggled. 2 bloodguard clung to his arms, and he battered them against the sides of the rift, hissing rapaciously, "Release me! Release! I want them!" as if he wished to leap down into the gorge. "No!" Abruptly, Prothal stood before the giant. The backlight of the sunset dimmed his face as he stood silhouetted against the glow with his arms wide and his staff held high. He was old and only half the giant's size, but the orange-red fire seemed to expand him, make him taller, more full of authority. "Rock brother, master yourself. By the 7, do you rave?" At that, foam follower threw off the bloodguard. He caught the front of Prothal's robe, heaved the High Lord into the air, pinned him against the wall. Into his face the giant wheezed as if he were choking with rage. "Rave? You accuse me?" The bloodguard sprang toward foam follower, but a shout from Moram stopped them. Prothal hung clamped against the stone like a handful of old rags, but his eyes did not flinch. He repeated, "Do you rave?" For one horrible moment, foam follower held the High Lord as if he meant to murder him with one huge squeeze of his fist. Covenant tried to think of something to say, some way to intervene, but he could not. He had no conception of what had happened to foam follower. Then from behind Covenant, First Mark Tuvor said clearly, "A raver in one of the Sea Rage giants? Impossible." As if impaled by Tuvor's assertion, foam follower broke into a convulsion of coughing. The violence of his reaction knotted his gnarled frame. He lowered Prothal, then collapsed backward, falling with a thud against the opposite wall. Slowly, his paroxysm changed into a low chuckle like the glee of hysteria. Heard through the groaning of the river, that sound made Covenant's skin crawl like a slimy caress. He could not abide it. Driven by a need to learn what had befallen foam follower, he moved forward to look into the gorge. There, braced now against his vertigo and the inundation of the river roar, he saw what had ignited foam follower. "Ah, giant," he groaned, "to kill." Below him, and barely 20 feet above the level of the river, was a narrow roadway, like a ledge in the south wall of the gorge. And along the roadway, to the beat of unheard drums, marched an army of cave wights out of Mount Thunder, captained by a wedge of Urviles. File after file of the gangrel creatures jerked out of the mountain and tramped along the ledge with a glare of lust in their laval eyes. Thousands had already left their white warrens, and behind them the files continued, as if Mount Thunder were spewing all the hordes of its inhabiting vermin into the undefended earth. Foam follower. For a moment, Covenant's heart beat to the rhythm of the giant's pain. He could not bear to think that foam follower and his people might lose their hope of home because of creatures like those. Is killing the only answer? Numbly, half blindly, he began looking for the way in which foam follower had meant to reach the ledge and the cave wights. He found it easily enough. It looked simple for anyone not timorous of heights. There was a rude, slick stair cut into the rock of the south wall from the rift down to the roadway. Opposite it were steps which went from the rift up to the top of the gorge. They were as grey, spray-worn, and old as native stone. Lord Moram had come up behind Covenant. His voice reached dimly through the river roar. "This is the ancient look of Treacher's Gorge. That part of the first ward which tells of this place is easily understood. It was formed for the watch and concealment of the betrayers. For here at Treacher's Gorge, Lord Fowl the Despiser revealed his true self to High Lord Kevin. Here was struck the first blow of the open war, which ended in the ritual of desecration. Before that time, Kevin Landwaster doubted Lord Fowl without knowing why, for the Despiser had enacted no ill which Kevin could discover, and he showed trust for Lord Fowl out of shame for his unworthy doubt. Then, through the Despiser's plotting, a message came to the Council of Lords from the Demondim in Mount Thunder. The message asked the Lords to come to the Demondim lore works, the spawning crypts where the Erviles were made, to meet with the lore masters who claimed knowledge of a secret power. Clearly, Lord Fowl intended for Kevin to go to Mount Thunder, but the High Lord doubted and did not go. Then he was ashamed of his doubt and sent in his stead some of his truest friends and strongest allies. So a high company of the old lords rafted, as was their wont, down the Soul Seas through Andalane to Mount Thunder, and here, in the roar and spray and ill of Treacher's Gorge, they were ambushed by Erviles. They were slaughtered, and their bodies sent to the abyss of the mountain. Then marched armies like these out of the catacombs, and the land was plunged all unready into war. That long conflict went on, battle after death-littered battle without hope. High Lord Kevin fought bravely, but he had sent his friends into ambush. Soon he began his midnight meetings with despair, and there was no hope. The seductive, dizzy rush of the water drained Covenant's resistance. Spray beaded on his face like sweat. Foam Follower had wanted to do the same thing, leap into the writhing allure of the gorge, fall on the cave whites from ambush. With an effort that made him moan through his clenched teeth, Covenant backed away from the look. Gripping himself against the wall, he asked without apparent transition, "Is he still laughing?" Moram appeared to understand. No. Now he sits and quietly sings the song of the unhomed and gives no sign. "Foam Follower," Covenant breathed. "Why did you stop the Blood Guard? He might have hurt Prothol." The Lord turned his back on Treacher's Gorge to face Covenant. "Saltheart Foam Follower is my friend. How could I interfere?" A moment later he added, "The High Lord is not defenseless." Covenant persisted. "Maybe a raver." "No." Moram's flat assertion acknowledged no doubt. Tuvor spoke truly. No raver has the might to master a giant. But something, Covenant groped. Something is hurting him. He doesn't believe those omens. He thinks drool or something is going to prevent the giants from going home. Moram's reply was so soft that Covenant was forced to read it on his crooked lips. "So do I." Foam Follower. Covenant looked down the rift at the giant. In the darkness, Foam Follower sat like a lump of shale against one wall, singing quietly and staring at invisible visions on the stone before him. The sight brought up a surge of sympathetic anger in Covenant, but he clamped it down, clutched his bargain. The walls of the rift leaned in toward him like suffocating fear, dark wings. He thrust himself past the giant and out toward the ravine. Before long, the company gathered there for supper. They ate by the light of one dim Lilianro torch, and when the meal was done, they tried to get some sleep. Covenant felt that rest was impossible. He sensed the army of cave whites unrolling like a skein of destruction for the weaving of the land's death. But the ceaseless roar of the river lulled him until he relaxed against the ground. He dozed slightly with the drums of war throbbing in the rock under him. Later he found himself sharply awake. The red moon had passed the crest of Mount Thunder and now glared straight down on the ravine. He guessed that midnight was past. At first he thought that the moon had roused him with its nearly full stare, but then he realized that the vibration of the drums was gone from the rock. He glanced around the camp and saw Tuvor whispering with High Lord Prothol. The next moment Tuvor began waking the sleepers. Soon the warriors were alert and ready. Covenant had his knife in the belt of his robe, his staff in his hand. Biranair held aloft a rod with a small flame flickering from its tip, and in that uncertain light Moram and Prothol stood together with Mainthrall Lithe, Warhaft Quan, and the first mark. Dim shadows shifted like fear and resolution across Prothol's face. His voice sounded weak with age as he said, "Now is our last hour of open sky. The outpouring of Drul's army has ended. Those of us who will must go into the catacombs of Mount Thunder. We must take this chance to enter while Drul's attention is still with his army, before he can perceive that we are not where he thinks us to be. Now is the time for those who would to lay down the quest. There can be no retreat or escape after failure in the White Moorlands. The quest has already been bravely served. None who now lay it down need feel shame." "Carefully," Quan said. "Do you turn back, High Lord?" "Ah, no," sighed Prothol. "The hand of these times is upon me. I dare not falter." Then Quan replied, "Can a yeoman of the War Ward of Lord's Keep turn back when the High Lord leads? Never." And the yeoman echoed, "Never." Covenant wondered where Foamfollower was, what the giant would do. For himself, he felt intuitively sure that he had no choice, that his dream would only release him by means of the Staff of Law, or by death. The next moment, Mainthrall Lithe spoke to Prothol. Her head was back, and her slim form was primed as if she were prepared to explode. "I gave my word. Your horses will be tended. The cords will preserve them in hope of your return. But She shook her bound hair as if she were defying herself. "I will go with you, under the ground." Prothal's protest she stopped with a sharp gesture. "You set an example I must follow. How could I stand before a Ranahid again if I come so far only to turn away when the peril becomes great? And I feel something more. The Ramen know the sky, the open earth. We know air and grass. We do not lose our way in darkness. The Ranahin have taught our feet to be sure. I feel that I will always know my way, outward. You may have need of me, though I am far from the plains of Ra and from myself." The shadows formed Prothal's face into a grimace, but he responded quietly, "I thank you, Mainthrall. The Ramen are brave friends of the land." Casting his eyes over the whole company, he said, "Come, then. The outcome of our quest awaits. Whatever may befall us, as long as there are people to sing, they will sing that in this dark hour the land was well championed. Now be true to the last." Without waiting for an answer, he went out of the bloody moonlight into the rift. The warriors let Covenant follow behind the two lords as if according him a position of respect. Prothol and Moram walked side by side, and when they neared the look, Covenant could see from between them Foamfollower standing at the edge of the cliff, The giant had his palms braced over his head on either wall. His back was to the lords. He stared into the bleak, blood-hued writhing of the river. His huge form was dark against the vermilion sky. When the lords came near him, he said, as if he were speaking back to them from the gorge, "I remain here, my watch. I will guard you. Drool's army will not trap you in Mount Thunder while I live." A moment later he added, as if he had recognized the bottom of himself, "From here I will not smell the white warrens." But his next words carried an echo of old giantish humor. The catacombs were not made to accommodate creatures the size of giants. "You choose well," murmured Prothol. "We need your protection, but do not remain here after the full moon. If we do not return by that time, we are lost, and you must go to warn your people." Foam Follower answered, as if in reply to some other voice, "Remember the oath of peace. In the maze where you go, it is your lifeline. It preserves you against Soul Crusher's purposes, hidden and savage. Remember the oath. It may be that hope misleads, but hate corrupts. I have been too quick to hate. I become like what I abhor." "Have some respect for the truth," Moram snapped. The sudden harshness of his tone startled Covenant. "You are Saltheart Foam Follower of the Sea-Reach Giants, rock brother to the men of the land. That name cannot be taken from you." But Covenant had heard no self-pity in the giant's words, only recognition and sorrow. Foam Follower did not speak again. He stood as still as the walls against which he braced himself, stood like a statue carved to occupy the look. The lords spent no more time with him. Already the night was waning, and they wanted to enter the mountain before daylight. The questers took positions. Prothol, Baronair, and 2 Blood Guard followed first Mark Tuvor. Then came Moram, Lithe, Banor, Covenant, and Korik. Then came Warhaft Quan, his 14 warriors, and the last 4 Blood Guard. They were only 29 against all of Drool Rockworm's unknown might. They strung a line of Klingor from Tuvor to the last Blood Guard. In single file, they started down the slick stair into Treacher's Gorge.